The Battle of Fuentes de Oñoro, a clash between a mixed British and Portuguese army commanded by Sir Arthur Wellesley, Viscount Wellington, and the Armée du Portugal, a force assembled for the third French invasion of Portugal that would finally subdue the country to French rule and drive out the British from the Iberian Peninsula. Marshal André Masséna had been appointed commander-in-chief of this army in the year before, and would march it deep into the country all the way to the lines of Torres Vedras, a chain of fortifications, redoubts, and earthworks built in secret beforehand at Wellington's orders to protect Lisbon from just such an offensive by the French. The lines proved impregnable, and all the countryside around was stripped of resources. The French held their ground for a few winter months, but Masséna was eventually compelled to withdraw his battered and starving troops in the spring of 1811. By this point, Wellington had regained the initiative and mobilized his army into a hot pursuit of the retreating French, though was held back thanks to a series of sharp delaying actions fought by the French rearguard, 6th Corps, commanded by Marshal Michel Ney. The French army managed to cross back into Spain in early April and headed straight for their depots near Salamanca to resupply, reform, and seek fresh troops. By this point, Masséna had failed in his task completely, the only achievement he could claim in Portugal being the capture of the border fortress of Almeida in the year before. The fortress had fallen into French hands after a very short siege when its gunpowder magazine exploded, causing much death, destruction, and structural damage. This had all been repaired in the meantime, however, and the fortress was now well garrisoned with French troops and a very capable and energetic governor, General Brenier. Almeida was a crucial strategic point on one of the main corridors between Portugal and Spain, and Wellington had no intention to follow Masséna across the border before retaking this fortress that stood on his line of communications or potential retreat. He detached a division of his army to besiege Almeida and concentrated the rest a few kilometers to the southeast, around the village of Fuentes de Oñoro. By late April, Masséna had brought the Armée du Portugal back into fighting trim and additionally received a small reinforcement from Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bessières. Bessières strongly disliked Masséna and had at first claimed his own army was fully committed, fighting guerrillas and insurgencies in northern Spain and keeping the roads to France clear. However, he did send a small force of 2 cavalry brigades, one of which from the Imperial Guard, which he brought over in person. Masséna guessed that he would soon be relieved of his command. He had failed his task and let down the army, had made a number of reckless and erratic decisions throughout the campaign that cost many French lives, like at the Battle of Busaco. He had even recently dismissed the popular Ney after he refused to obey a direct, albeit rather dubious, order. In fact, at the time the battle took place, Marshal Auguste de Marmont had already received instructions to assume command of the Armée du Portugal, and was en route to do so. Masséna resolved to march to relieve Almeida, hoping that he would bring Wellington to battle and defeat him in a general engagement that would break the British and Portuguese army, and so redeem himself in front of his emperor. His army had rested and restored its morale, and was eager to finally turn back and fight. They knew that despite his recent shortcomings, Masséna had gained great fame for his generalship in his wars against the Austrians, and they believed he could yet lead them to victory and glory. In early May 1811, the British outposts from the Light Division reported to Wellington that all roads from Ciudad Rodrigo were black with French columns, as Masséna's army was marching west. Wellington had excellent intelligence brought to him by Portuguese and Spanish partisans alike on a regular basis. He knew that he was likely outnumbered, but probably not by very much. In fact, the French were bringing roughly 8,000 more infantry and more than double the amount of cavalry he had at his disposal. However, he fancied his chances and was in a fighting mood, so he deployed to the north of Fuentes de Oñoro to meet Masséna and cover the siege of Almeida. The Battle of Fuentes de Oñoro would be the last time Wellington faced off against Masséna, that sly old fox, as he called him. The terrain chosen by Wellington was right on the border between Portugal and Spain, which crosses this map roughly through the middle along a north-south direction. He anchored his right flank in the village of Fuentes de Oñoro, which he garrisoned with several light companies, and arrayed the bulk of his army on the low ridge between two shallow streams, the Turon to the west and the Dos Casas to the east. The Allied army was thus deployed to block the path towards Almeida, which is off the map, not too far in the northwest direction. The position had several advantages. As he would often do, Wellington deployed on the reverse slope of this low ridge. This offered protection from enemy artillery, but, more crucially, it kept the exact disposition of the army hidden from the French. The two streams were shallow and fordable on foot in and south of Fuentes, but to the north their course ran through deeper ravines, making that sector easier to defend. The French attack would have to come close to the village itself. Despite its apparent strength, Wellington's position had two major weaknesses. A few kilometers behind was the deep ravine where the Coa River ran its course. Spring rains had swollen its flow, making it only possible to cross via a handful of bridges. If the Allied army would be beaten here, it risked becoming bottlenecked on its retreat across these bridges and potentially destroyed. The southern sector was crisscrossed with marshy wooded areas among low hills and open fields, but could be crossed by infantry, cavalry and artillery. Wellington's right flank was susceptible to being turned. Even worse, such a maneuver could threaten the Allied army's lines of communication and would force Wellington into a hasty and dangerous retreat northwest towards Almeida. On May the 2nd, the French army began to appear on the scene. Joined by members of his staff, Massena surveyed the enemy position in the late afternoon. He quickly understood the importance of Fuentes de Oñoro and decided he would make his attack there. The next day, Massena ordered a frontal assault on the village, a task which fell on Ferré's division from 6th Corps, 10 battalions strong, organized in 2 brigades. Holding the town were light companies from British, Portuguese and King's German Legion infantry, as well as detachments from the 60th and 95th Rifle Regiments. The fighting was bloody, for every street and every house. The Allied troops held on stubbornly but were slowly being cleared out of the village by late afternoon. Wellington ordered the Highlanders from the 79th Foot and 71st Light Infantry to counterattack, and the Scots charge drove the French back across the Dos Casas stream. Just like at Busaco, Massena's frontal assault had been repulsed with loss, but the Marshal now knew that Wellington was well dug in. There was no fighting on the following day, the two armies tensely facing off from their own positions relatively close to each other. The Allied army observed small cavalry detachments patrolling everywhere across their front, as Massena had asked his cavalry general, Louis-Pierre de Montbrun, to do a thorough reconnaissance of the enemy deployment. That evening, Montbrun returned with important news. Wellington was weak south of Fuentes de Oñoro, with only 1 battalion and a handful of cavalry pickets holding the village of Pozo Velho. With this information, Massena resolved to turn Wellington's right flank and issued his general orders for the main battle. Massena committed a powerful force to this grand turning maneuver. The cavalry would open hostilities, Montbrun having his entire dragoon division at his command, plus Vattier and Fournier's light cavalry brigades. In reserve was Le Pic's Imperial Guard cavalry, which included fierce units like the Old Guard Grenadiers à Cheval and Chasseurs à Cheval. Infantry and artillery would immediately follow, and Massena committed 2 divisions from 6th Corps into the first wave, those of Marchand and Mermet. These were seasoned troops, having seen action on many occasions during the late campaign, under the skilled command of Ney, who had by now been recalled to France. Supporting them was Solignac's division from Jean-Androche Junot's 9th Corps. This overwhelming force would smash through the weakly held Pozo Velho and attack Wellington's right flank. As he would redeploy to respond to this threat, Massena would launch another assault on the now weakened Fuentes de Oñoro, and the 2 movements would crush the Allied right and center. The troops assaulting the village were again Ferré's division, supported by Drouet's 9th Corps. On the difficult right flank, Reynier's 2nd Corps would merely demonstrate in front of whatever opposition it faced, unless or until it became clear that the other attacks were successful, in which case Reynier would launch his own attack. Wellington suspected the French might contemplate an attack in the south, so he deployed all of his British and German cavalry to screen his far right flank in front of Poço Velho. He additionally moved Houston's 7th Division behind that village, posting 1 British and 1 Portuguese light battalion in Poço Velho itself. Wellington still hoped, however, that the main thrust would come through Fuentes de Oñoro. Here he stationed the Highlanders of the 79th and 71st Light Infantry, while the rest of Brent Spencer's 1st Division was deployed on the heights behind the town. Further back, in reserve, were his 2 best divisions, Thomas Picton's 3rd and Robert Crawford's battle-hardened Light Division. North of Fuentes de Oñoro was Alexander Campbell's 6th Division, while on the extreme left flank was the rather incompetent and mentally unstable William Erskine and his 5th Division, supported by a Portuguese cavalry brigade. On May the 5th, at dawn, Allied cavalry pickets, including a small guerrilla band led by Julian Sanchez, began to see French cavalry emerging from the morning fog around the village of Nave de Aver. The British Light Dragoons and King's German Hussars charged, but soon understood they were facing overwhelming numbers and fell back towards Poço Velho. The 2 light battalions posted in the village were surprised and mauled quite badly, but some men managed to escape and rejoin Houston's main body, covered by the British cavalry, which charged by squadrons to buy time, losing many men but keeping formation throughout. The 7th Division began to form up to meet the Dragoons and managed to stall their progress, but the French infantry columns began to emerge behind, sweeping through Poço Velho and coming to Montbrun's support. By this stage, Wellington understood that he had severely underestimated the magnitude of the French attack in the south. Massena's movements revealed an intention to fight a hard and decisive battle and not outmaneuver the British and Portuguese into a dangerous position. Instead of following up the sweeping move and sending infantry to pierce Wellington's lines of communication on the Coa, Marchand and Mermet were heading north towards the Allied army, while Montbrun continued to harass the 7th Division, attempting to isolate it. Wellington reacted quickly. He redeployed his main force on Potence, turning Spencer's 1st Division to face this sudden threat. Further, he sent Crawford's Light Division straight into the French maelstrom to cover Houston's retreat, who was ordered to place his troops on the western extreme of this new line, across the Turon stream. Crawford's division performed remarkably. They deployed to block Montbrun's way and began a disciplined fighting withdrawal, formed up in battalion squares with the British and KGL cavalry in the intervals, supported by a troop of the Royal Horse Artillery. The British cavalry repeatedly charged French guns brought up quickly to target the infantry squares, and prevented them from firing efficiently for the most part, though 1 light dragoon squadron got badly mauled in one such charge. They also constantly repelled Montbrun's pursuing dragoons and mounted chasseurs, charging by squadrons every time the French came close. Both divisions reached the main body of Wellington's army safely, Crawford's barely suffering any losses, and each took their designated place in the line. At this point, spectators witnessed a thick cloud of dust being kicked up, and French cavalrymen all converging on one point. Shots were heard, weapons flashed, and then Captain Norman Ramsay burst out of the commotion, cutting his way out at the head of his horse artillery troop at full gallop. He had stopped to fire a quick round, one of many, but lingered a moment too long, and the unit of chasseurs à cheval moved to cut off his retreat. Slade's cavalry turned and charged the French, while Ramsay brought off his guns unscathed, to the cheers of the British infantry from Spencer's division, who had witnessed everything. Montbrun considered the time was prime for a general attack on Wellington's line, still in the process of forming up. He sent for the Imperial Guard cavalry, but was stunned to receive a sharp reply from their brigadier, Louis Lepic, that they would not draw their swords and commit to battle without a direct order from Bessières. At this critical juncture, the Marshal was nowhere to be found and the moment was lost. Bessieres' actions were widely criticized and illustrate the chronic lack of cooperation and power struggles among the French marshals in the peninsula. Some historians believe that Bessieres wanted to be present on the field in the event of a major victory, but otherwise intended to commit as little as possible. In the event, Montbrun's cavalry attacks gradually died off, although some units managed to surprise a few companies of the British Scots Guards in line, inflicting some casualties. The 2 infantry divisions from 6th Corps moved up to join Montbrun, but halted in front of Wellington's new line, waiting for orders. As the grand flanking maneuver was developing on the French left, Masséna set in motion the second phase of his plan. With Wellington's main line rolled into an angle, with its tip resting in Fuentes de Oñoro, Masséna intended to pierce the Allied center with a vigorous attack through the village and, linking with the 3 infantry divisions and Montbrun's cavalry on the left, destroy the main body of the British and Portuguese army. Around 2 hours after hostilities had begun on the left flank, Ferré's division from 6th Corps was once again ordered to storm the village. As 2 days before, the fighting was fierce, hand-to-hand combat against an obstinate enemy. The 2 Highlander battalions stationed in Fuentes de Oñoro were slowly repulsed in the upper half of the village, but countercharged with support from the 24th Foot and gained back the lost ground nearly down to the Dos Casas. By this point, Ferré's division was spent, but marching to its support were 2 fresh divisions, the 8th Corps of Jean-Baptiste Drouet, Comte d'Erlon. Drouet first sent forward 3 elite battalions composed of 18 grenadier companies. Wearing their tall bearskin caps, they were mistaken by the British for the Imperial Guard. The grenadiers advanced with great courage and swept up their opposition to the heights behind, but losses were great and the fighting was brutal, and they could not advance further. However, Drouet intended to finish the job and fed more troops from both divisions into the melee. At the head of this new column was the 9e Léger, Napoleon's incomparable light infantry, albeit their weaker 4th Battalion. These new troops dislodged the defenders all the way to the church on the top of the hill, and the 9th began to open the way towards the flank of Picton's 3rd Division. This was the crisis point for Wellington, the critical moment that would decide the outcome of the battle. Mackinnon's brigade from Picton's division requested permission to attack, quickly granted to them by the commander-in-chief. Leading the charge were the Irish 88th Foot, the Connaught Rangers, who violently clashed with the 9th and fought hand-to-hand with the bayonet for a while, before the French light infantry began to give way and fall back upon the column behind. The 74th Highlanders, charging on a parallel street, helped to enhance the shock of the already tried French infantry which, seeing their main column beaten back, began to give way at every point. The withdrawal turned into a rout, and the British troops swept down into the village and pursued the enemy all the way down to the stream, where Drouet posted his remaining infantry to cover the withdrawal. Fuentes de Oñoro had held, and Masséna's attack was repulsed with loss. Failing to break Wellington's center, Masséna called off the flanking force, and by the afternoon the decisive combat was over, with only spurious skirmishing trailing into the evening. Wellington was self-critical of his handling of the battle, and later stated that he had never been in a worse scrape. He ran significant risks, overextending a weak right flank, which could have exposed his line of retreat and left his army in a dangerous position. Nevertheless, he had promptly and skillfully redeployed 4 infantry divisions into a new and strong position to meet the developing threat. He extricated the isolated 7th Division and repelled attacks on both fronts. The British and Portuguese army had held its ground and successfully covered the siege of Almeida. With no relief in sight, on the night of the 10th, the intrepid Brenier managed to slip away with its garrison and blew up the fort's magazine. Wellington was furious with the complacency of the 2 divisions charged with the siege, Campbell's and Erskine's. Still, the last French troops were now across the border. Portugal was liberated. After this battle, Masséna was recalled to France and never held high command again. Marshal Marmont had taken his place at the head of the Armée du Portugal, and he too would clash with Wellington at the decisive Battle of Salamanca in 1812.